Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 163, Creative Experimentation, Alteration, Combination, Expansion, and Constrictions. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome on this Education Friday to the Takeup, where we are going to talk about all things embroidery and design and creativity today. It's going to be kind of a wild ride through lots of little samples, discussions, and honestly, I want this to just open up some concepts for you for how you go about creative thought, how you go about getting information, inspiration, and honestly, if you can, how you do some play, how you get out there and make some things happen out of that inspiration. How do we create once we get all these inspirational elements, once we start to consume other types of design and embroidery that help us get there? And like I said in the original setup for this piece, and as you can see on the thumbnail, a couple of different things to talk about. Alteration, what can we change? Combination, what can we put together? Expansion, what can we add? And constrictions, how can we narrow down our focus in order to give us more creative gusto, in order to give us something that allows us to provide more value for customers or for those we are creating our embroidery for, and to expand beyond, or at the very least, create something different. It doesn't always have to be expansive. And here's the thing too, create something that is of value, that is of interest, that not only delights people. I love that people love this stuff, but it catches their eye. And if we're in the realm of something like promotional products or commercial embroidery, it not only catches the eye, but it inspires people, makes people more likely to purchase, more likely to stick with us. That's one of the things I want to get to. How do we get more creative? What can we do with different kind of methods and methodologies? And how do we use these to take inspiration without doing knockoffs, right? Because that's some part of the problem we have. Sometimes people will get inspiration, but what they do is essentially create knockoff pieces, literally take a piece that they've seen that they like and say, oh, I was very inspired by it. And so that inspiration becomes a direct copying. The thing is, we really don't have to. There's so much out there. And frankly, the best way we can stand out, the best way we can provide more value is by injecting our own creativity into the piece. Anyone can go to the most popular designs on whatever a particular platform you're on in the home world. That's often Etsy. We can also go, like, if you're someone like me who does retail research, and we'll talk about retail research again later with my little scare quotes on it. You look at things that are on the high street, there are things in fashion. You can go and knock off the most popular designs that are out there, and you may have some takers. However, you're never going to step forward to do more custom work, to do more creative work, unless you bring something new or something unique to that arena. You can't just go in and do knockoffs and expect that that will help you to stand out. You won't stand out. And honestly, you're not the only one who's had the concept. You're not the only one who said something is popular. Maybe I should make that too. So frankly, if you ever want to get out to that blue sky, that area where, the open ocean where we're not chumming the waters and it's not just sharks biting sharks. If you want to get out to that space where you have some room to breathe and to create, the best way to do that is to start injecting your own sensibilities and your own particular viewpoints and mix of inspirations into your piece, getting those pieces in front of people, showing the kind of work you want to do, and then finding that tribe that values that stuff, right? Finding the people who value the things you value. And also, in that world of getting inspiration, when you are around that tribe and you find that you're not entirely jiving with everything they want, being able to suss out, to find out what's important to a group of people that you want to target, that you want to purchase your work or to enjoy your work, and find out through what is important to them, how we can bring that into our own work, how we can bring that into the creations that we make down the road. So a lot of today is going to be talking about creativity, some technique stuff, some stuff about materials, some stuff about digitizing, probably not dead into how do I draw bits and bobs. We're going to be talking more about how do I get inspired and how do I mix that stuff together. This is something that I planned for a while. I actually started on the topic of how constrictions help creativity a couple weeks ago, and we really didn't get to it. I just spouted off a little bit about it as quickly as I could, but it was a fantastic fit considering this morning, if you guys didn't know, I got to co-host the show that I produce, which is the Two Regular Guys podcast. I co-hosted with Aaron Montgomery this morning and got to talk to the wonderful Jeremy Picker of Amber Creative. So Amber Creative, AMB3R if you're looking for it. Jeremy Picker if you're looking for him on social media anywhere. wonderful creative guy who does very similar things to what I'm talking about today. And frankly, I was very much a business to business guy and didn't get to stretch as much as I would like to in my commercial life. Go check out the stuff from Jeremy and go look at the last couple episodes of the Two Regular Guys podcast. If you're on the YouTube channel with me right now, you'll actually find it in a playlist where I put any of the times that I'm co-hosting. It's actually in a playlist from my channel of my guest appearances. So you'll be able to find it there as well as the Two Regular Guys channel. But if you're already on my channel, easy enough for you to go over and find Jeremy Picker and also last week, Joe Kramer, who got on talking about very similar kind of things. But first, before we get further into this process of discussing, alteration, combination, expansion, and constriction, all these things that we're going to use to enhance our creativity, I do want to talk to people who are here live. If you are on hashtag Replay Squad, that's cool. We're glad to have you here. Please ask your questions either directly to me or in the comments. We do like to answer those whenever we can. We do get back to you guys, but for the people who are live, I do say hi and I do interact. So first we have Cindy King out in Texas saying, good afternoon, Cindy. Happy to have you here. Barb is coming in from Minnesota. We've got Joe Rita coming in from Austin. Frank from over in the UK, also an awesome sharer and educator himself. I've got all you guys talking to each other, which I love. When you're talking to each other in the comments, the best thing you can follow up and do from this is not just to come to me for questions, but go to each other for questions. That fellowship of decorators is something real, and it absolutely helps everybody get more out of everything that you do here, because everybody comes with their own unique viewpoint, style, and inspirations that come from their life, from their interests, and that has a bearing on the way that they execute and the way they create. So it's great to see that from everybody. Everybody also serves different markets. If you serve different markets and segments, it helps you to see that different way that they have to execute, the kinds of garments they use, the kinds of techniques that are important to their particular clientele. If you see that from different segments all over the world, all over the country that you're in, and from different sides, different kind of verticals, and different levels of engagement with the commercial world, you'll start to see this wider world of embroidery and decoration that really can inspire you. So thank you for showing up. Got Scott from Sunrise Tactical Gear saying happy Friday to everybody. Love it. And yeah, Gail coming in, copy the style and techniques with your own designs. Going to talk about that later. How do we work on things? And one of them is to learn technique and make design yourself. Love that stuff. We got people saying hi to each other. Love that. Cam's coming in from Texas. Hi, Cam. Happy to have you in here. And Marianne's coming back on from MAS out in Santa Fe, New Mexico, just north of myself here in Albuquerque. And you can't help to see that I'm doing stuff from Albuquerque here. You'll see some of the products that I show, some of the things that I've created definitely have a uniquely Albuquerque or New Mexico flair. And hey, I'm not going to hide that at all. I am born and raised from New Mexico. I'm a Burqueño through and through. All right, so Sheila is also coming in from Tennessee. Happy to have you on, Sheila. But let's get into this thing, right? Like I said, this will be a looser discussion, hopefully. I do want to hear from you guys. If you have things that help you creatively to make new pieces, hey, you've got links to cool stuff. You've got things that you like to use to do research. You have places you like to go to look at great decoration or to look at cool art. By all means, share them in the comments and let me know, and I will bring those up. And ask your questions. We might not get to them, and especially if they're way off topic, sometimes I'll answer those privately, but I definitely want to hear from you guys. All right. But this is the thing. Like I said, we're talking about creativity, and whenever we talk about creativity, I think that there are kind of two halves to this. Many people get very focused on the actual creation itself, the act of making the thing. And I think that we forget that this thing is really made of these two halves. It really comes from soaking things in, absorbing creative material, making sure you get inspired by that creative material, and seeking out kind of a constant source of inspirational stuff from all over the gamut. It can be a lot of other decoration. In fact, the first thing I tell embroiders when they're having a lot of trouble, especially digitizers, having a ton of trouble coming up with their original pieces, they're executing in ways that aren't working for them. They're using stitch types that don't really work in certain areas. Lots of them will say, all right, I need to go and have a step-by-step guide or a book or project guide. And yes, all of those things are helpful. Hey, come into my classes is helpful. However, one of the most helpful things you can do for yourself is to go consume embroidery, to go look at existing embroideries, and not only just machine embroidery. Looking at machine embroidery is fantastic because it's going to be done under the same constrictions, under the same technical needs that you will have if you're a machine embroiderer. But looking at the way people make marks with thread, the way that they cover areas, the way that they apply materials, especially in a world where the internet is so ubiquitous. When I very first started, the internet was not like it is now. Now there is very little excuse not to look at other embroidery, often in super high resolution images that we can zoom in on, and see how things are put together. How are letters crafted? What stitch types do you use for certain size elements? How do you put blends together? I've done multiple episodes on how to analyze existing embroidery to find these things out, to learn about stitch types and what have you. But I'm going to say, yes, absolutely the first thing you need to do. Certainly, looking at existing embroidery is fantastic. Running designs that run well and being at the machine to run them is paramount to learning all the interactions between thread, material, stabilizer, needle, and the machine in general, how the movements of the machine, seeing all those interactions and how those things work are definitely going to, that's definitely going to feed into how you understand things like distortion and compensation. But artistically, it really helps to think in the medium and to understand what it is that embroidery gives us, right? So yes, we are going to talk about these other methods. Like I said, the alteration, combination, expansion, constrictions. Those are definitely on the menu today, but I want you to certainly remember we are working in a medium and we should be thinking about that medium. Certainly, I'm going to talk about multimedia and adding other media to what we do as embroiderers, but I just want to make it really clear. Sometimes we need to think, hey, what is it that is unique to embroidery that we can use? What are those elements that we can adjust, that we can work with as digitizers, as embroiderers, as people ordering from other digitizers, as people who are going to create with certain materials? What is it about embroidery that's unique? And I think some of the things that I always call out, and it's worthwhile just to call them out again today as we start, texture. Embroidery has real physical texture because thread is a physical object. So we have texture, and we're going to talk about also different threads and how that plays into that. We have real dimension. Things are layered from the first thing that runs to the last thing that runs. We can layer them. We can layer materials like applique as well, stitch on top of them. We can stitch on top of a print. So we literally have two levels, a printed flat layer and a stitched layer on top. So we can work with physical dimension. We can use three-dimensional foam or other insert materials in order to lift the material, lift the thread away from the fabric itself and further toward us. We get full realized dimension. We have three dimensions to work with. We have sheen, so the quality of the thread itself. So we can also talk about other things with that thread because thickness is also part of it, and that goes back into texture. But we have the sheen of the thread. So most of our thread is shiny, but not all. We can work with matte finish threads, metallic threads that have an even higher sheen and that sparkle, and we can work with the shininess of it threads itself to create a play of light with stitch angles. So now we're working in design, we're working into how it's digitized, but we get to use the sheen of the thread and the reflectivity. The angle of the stitches change how much things reflect. As that stitch angle changes, we know that it changes the perception of color and the way light reflects off of it. And that means we have this extra dimension we can play with that might not be present in print. The physical nature of the thread, the way it reflects light, and how stitch angle affects it lets us work with the play of light across a design, break up objects into multiple smaller objects with different stitch types and textures and stitch angles. And we are allowed then to make something more than the original art by using the unique characteristics of thread. So that's what I'm talking about here. We need to think about those unique characteristics of embroidery that we have with us that we can work with, and keep those in mind whenever we're intaking all of this kinds of, inspiration from the retail world, inspiration from the fiber arts world, inspiration from anywhere. Think, how can I apply the things I know about thread, the things I know about applique materials, the things I know about comparing these things, about contrast between adjacent materials, about contrast between adjacent stitch angles, to use texture, dimension, the sheen of the thread, the play of light, and the variability of all these things that I can get out of embroidery, the dimension, the thickness, the differences in stitch types and stitch lengths and texture. What can I do with those as inspired by the thing I'm looking at, as inspired by the type of art that's in front of me? How can I combine the nature physically of what I do with the inspiration graphically from the designs in front of me to create something not only interesting, but more valuable than a flat rendering? So think about that certainly, but then we're going to get into these techniques. Like I said, it's something that's worthwhile. Just consider for a moment whenever you're looking at embroidery that it has something unique to offer that is not the same as any other method of print. Instead of apologizing for things it doesn't do well, like very, very small details, very, very small text, smooth color gradients outside of using a color reel or doing mind-numbing digitizing like I've done many times in my life to make very smooth color gradients. Those things are things it doesn't do well, but instead of leaning into the things it doesn't do well, lean into the things it does best and use those to highlight the design you're working on. I've got a couple more comments here, so I'm going to jump in and just say hi to everybody. We got Marta coming in from Texas. Hi, Marta. We have David coming in from Colorado. Happy to see you here as well. And love to see you guys talking to each other. So like I said, mix it up in the comments, talk about the stuff with me, and by all means, let's discuss. And I will be adding as we go on, just looking through some designs and talking about some pieces that are in front of me just to kind of let you know these different kinds of combinations, the things that we can put together, the things we can alter, and what I'm talking about as far as what we can do with these different ways of transmuting what we currently have in front of us into something new and creative without necessarily having to just create from the blank page. And I think that's another reason people get caught up, honestly. Frankly, there are many people where when I talk to them about being more creative, the first thing they say is, I'm not an artist. And I say, you don't have to be an artist. I'm not a trained artist. I learned a fair amount of design work over time and design a lot of stuff over time. But I did a lot of that really coming out of having to do that, learning to do that on the fly. But when I started this, no art training, no ability to draw, nothing of that nature. And frankly, even now, I would certainly not consider myself a conventional artist. I am a good layout person. I can certainly draw. If I'm doing vector art, I can come up with some design work. I am better as a designer than I am as a fine artist. And even then, I think that I could use a heck of a lot more training to get better at it. I am not a trained graphic designer, don't have a degree there, but I do have some training not only at working at this stuff, but in giving myself inspiration and feeding into that entire kind of world of design. And in that interest, I think certainly I've gotten better. And I would encourage you guys still to play, to draw, to sketch, but to realize as embroiderers and digitizers, the thing we sketch, the thing we draw is never the thing we present. We present the embroidery. If you become a designer of embroidery, remember that only the embroidery matters. And we can totally composite photographs, sketch on top of them, make messy sketches that are never intended to be seen by the public, even when we are creating things whole cloth. And also secondarily, a lot of things we do get creative don't have to be redesigning the logo, don't have to be adding original art. That's why I talk about this, the alteration, combination, expansion, and constriction. These are ways to think and literal things we can do. We can start by altering stuff that already exists. We can work that way. And frankly, the other thing we talked about is we're going to be doing research. We're going to be looking at other people's work. And when we do that kind of research, I think that it's, this is the kind of the way that I always put it. The nicest way I have to say is this. I call it consuming broadly and creating with focus. So what do I mean by this? Consuming broadly means you take in inspiration from lots of different places, absolutely the embroidery world, the decoration world, but you look at all sorts of different art and typography and styles, things you're interested in, things that kind of vibe with you and the people you're around, certainly, but also look toward other stuff. When I go out to different cities to present and teach, I often go to the art museums that are local because that's one of the places I can go see historical textiles and posters and art, fine art, and get these different ideas about how they played with making marks, with design. Even things like home decor and furniture and architecture, all of these things can play into potentials for you to learn. What does create with focus mean? You bear down on a particular thing you're trying to achieve. Instead of just letting the blank page rule you, you start setting some rules in mind. And this is also that constriction we talked about. And you create with a purpose in mind. If you're doing it in a commercial way, you're looking toward the audience you want to help fulfill or energize or otherwise entertain. And you're making something that's for that audience to let them enjoy the piece, to make them want to wear the piece or use the thing that you've made, and for them to carry out and make their message known through the piece that you made. So you consume broadly, you create with focus, and then it stops us from doing the other thing. Admittedly, a good friend of mine, Jay Bassell, who's been on the Two Real Guys show many times, often calls what I call retail research, right? I call it retail research to go out and look at things that are currently out there on the street being sold. He calls it R&D, and this is that's not a research and development. He calls it rip off and duplicate. That's the not nice way of putting it. But here's the thing: what I mean by all of this, when you're consuming all that material and you're creating stuff, it really is for me more about imitating certain pieces of it, mashups, mix up, and remixes. So putting things together, changing things around, and remixing something in a different way, even with the same kind of status and the same sort of inspirations it started from. And also, especially when we're looking at things like embroidery directly, when it's something that is absolutely the work that we are going to do. So it's right up our alley. We're looking at another embroidered piece. Just like we talked about earlier, I believe Marta said, it might have been somebody else who was there who said this earlier, imitate technique and create design. So you go and find techniques, or you go and find parts of the design that's interesting to you, be that a color scheme, be that a texture, a use of materials, but you use it with art that is not the same as the original art you started with. And this doesn't mean a certain degree of changes. I mean, no, you literally take inspiration from one place and work on a design that's unrelated to that. So these are just things we should kind of keep in mind, right? Let's keep those in mind. Grab a couple comments. We'll also bring up some examples and just talk about these different things. So that's just it's a good way to get rolling. All right, got a couple more people saying hi. Ron says, hello. Hello, y'all. Better late than never to join you. Well, thank you very much for showing up. Grab your coffee and chill, and we'll have some good fun today. Linda says, altering stuff that already exists is my favorite method. There is nothing wrong with this. And if you're not a digitizer, there are still a massive number of things you can do. And in fact, we're going to talk about that. That's the first step of what we're talking about today, right? Alteration. So one of the things we can do when we talk about alteration, that's a nice fine word. I like to use words that sound very technical sometimes, like alteration, combination, expansion, and constriction. What does alteration really mean? It is, what can we change? When we're looking at an existing piece, what can we change about it? What can we turn around? What can we make differently? And I'll be scrolling around and showing you some of my examples of stuff, but let's just bring some basic stuff in here and talk about it, right? So I'm going to throw in a gallery of pieces. Hopefully we can get those to show. It doesn't look like we're showing right now. Let me go ahead and bring those back up for you guys if I can. I want to take that out. We'll see if we can get that to work. Unfortunately, for some reason, the screen is not showing for me. I'm going to represent that and try it again. Otherwise, we're not going to have a lot of graphics to show today. But let me go ahead and give it a shot. But yeah, we're going to show some pieces of mine because I like to show my stuff. I tell on myself first, so I'm not just showing everybody else's work. There are some pieces that are from friends of mine in this deck, but we are just going to go ahead and show you some stuff here first. Let's go ahead and try sharing the individual tab and see if that pops up for you. Awesome. All right, so we got that back. StreamYard hopefully will be our friend today. But suffice to say, we've got some different things that we're looking at here. But if we're on the terms of alteration, what I always say is, right, what can we change? And there's a few things we can change, right? What are the things we can talk about that make things different? Well, the environment. Let's bring this up. Environment in this case, meaning where does the design live? And that can be the garment or material that it's on. So what kind of garment is it on? Is it on something that's different than what it usually is intended to be on? Is it something that might be the garment is actually carrying it, where you're putting out a garment that's very interesting and it's carrying some of the visual interest in the piece rather than necessarily relying on the design itself? The placement. Is it in a place that's kind of interesting or awkward or different? Is it not necessarily where you usually see that kind of decoration? The application method. If we were using embroidery, can we print instead? Can we add something else to the print? Do we want to use rhinestones? Can we add that and do multimedia? Certainly that's another thing that's more like addition, but we can change the application. Like I said, decoration method. Go differently. Go embroidery instead of something that's printed, or vice versa, or use faux embroidery and do full color transfers. These are all things we can do. It's about what we can change. But let's go ahead and run back to some images and see if we can get some of that and talk to you about that stuff. Certainly we talk about things like the environment. Here's a piece that I did for folks, Keller Williams, right? It's a nice big real estate company. One of the things they wanted, they were like, man, we want to lean heavily into cheer one year. And it was the year of sparkle. They wanted everything sparkled, rhinestone crazy. And though the rhinestones were fantastic, and I did lots of rhinestone pieces for them, I don't know if I've got them on this deck, but I have some other rhinestone pieces that I did. I've done rhinestone design as not as much as embroidery, but certainly all along the same path as embroidery. And we ended up going with literal cheer stuff. So here we are creating for a bunch of real estate agents. However, what did we use? Full-on garments that were from cheer suppliers that had metallic fiber knit into the actual piece. So we went metallic on metallic, all crazy. Now you could say this is loud, this is wild, but this is one of those times where you're creating with focus. The people who wanted to wear this stuff, all they wanted was to have massive bling. Everything was bling that year and for actually years surrounding it. And all they wanted to do in general was to have the shiniest piece, especially when they have at these events that we did for them, they had what they called, I believe, the Red Ball, which is where all the people gathered together and had this gathering, and everyone wanted to wear branded gear. They all wore red. Some of them did more intricate dress, but for the rest of them, all they wanted was flashy, shiny, crazy gear that was going to show their spirit. And the thing they really leaned into that year and around that time was this super collegiate look. And they actually returned to this varsity look many times. But the thing you're going to see about that is we've done something different, right? How have we altered the piece? Well, we've altered the piece in a couple different ways. We're altering it by putting it on a different garment than you might usually use. It's not a standard sweatshirt. We went to the world of cheer garments to get garments for people who were wearing office casual, but that's what they wanted. We also went with a varsity style. Certainly that's more talking about a combination where we're combining a different style with the subject matter. Certainly this is much more of a varsity style. But the other alteration we did here is, in order for the customer to get the kind of value and price they wanted, we went with a printed material. This is glitter flake cut and applied material, so heat press material that was done instead of using full paved rhinestone work, because a lot of the full paved rhinestone work was much more expensive. And when we put it together with this really highly expensive blank, it can be prohibitive for the customer. So we still got to use creativity though, because that's the thing. One of the things that made our name when we were doing this company store work for them was that once they gave us some leeway and they trusted us, they let us take a very corporate logo setup or a very corporate image and make adjoining kind of combinations. Now we're going to talk combinations later, but we altered their look and said, you want something that's a different style, but still says the letters you want it to say, says the words you want to say, uses your color schemes, but we're going with a different inspirational style. And we actually did this several times, right? And we'll talk about combination of styles and remixes kind of later as well. But I can actually bring that up as we get rolling. Let's go ahead and bring this full screen again. I'll scroll through. You'll see all these different things we're going to talk about today. One of the other great things we did for Keller Williams, you may have seen it on this show before, is this piece where this is kind of a combination, right? This is alteration and combination. So one of the things we did here, we're looking toward that varsity style. But this logo inside this actual chenille logo that we had made, and this is something we didn't do chenille in-house, so we had this chenille made. We have the classic, the newer KW logo that was lowercase KW letters. This is a corporate logo executed in chenille. So we changed the execution style. We altered the execution, but the logo itself, the actual outlines of this piece, these are the outlines that are from the original art. So I didn't change the logo style itself in this one. So it wasn't a design change, it was an execution change. And then we can actually talk about like expansion as well, right? The expansion on this one is coordinating locations, different locations of the garment. So what do we have here? They have these different kind of things where if they've capped or if they're part of a specific group, if they've sold a certain amount, is what that capping is, that you actually got them these little kind of achievement patches that were going down the sleeve. And it was very much like somebody who was in a traditional letter jacket, somebody who was in sports who had, you know, championships or something else listed on their letter jacket. So here we are doing all of the above, right? Alteration. We're taking the original logo and altering the way that it's executed in a different material. Also, we're altering what it would go on. Here's something that's made for people in real estate, but we're not doing office casual, we're doing varsity. Combination, we're combining varsity style with the corporate logo that's there, and we're combining their corporate culture, the capping and the different groups they belong to, with the style from varsity, where we've got these adjoining patches and the left chest of the, you know, the letter jacket classic chenille. Also, we're expanding by adding multiple locations of decoration. And funny enough, I would even call it constrictions, because in this piece, we had to constrict ourselves to say, this is the budget we're working on. These are the styles we're going to choose. What can we get done? And what we could get done for this is we actually used a piece that was from Port Authority, and we got I believe this is Sport Tech. This is not a real leather jacket. So this is not a leather sleeve leather jacket. This is a knit, like heavy sweatshirt-like material, a sweatshirt fleece material that looks very much like a leather jacket, but isn't. And we kind of kept our ear to the ground, kept watching for things that were interesting to them, and this became something that we pitched. So all of these things kind of come together. Alteration, combination, expansion, and constriction to a degree. But the thing is, we didn't have to necessarily redesign. There is not a tremendous amount of design work or drawing that goes into this. Existing lettering style, very classic patch style that I put together for them, and in-house small run patch execution. So I think that's what we're looking at. We're trying to find something where we're saying, all right, alteration can happen that way. And we can even talk about just real simple things. What can we alter? Real simple stuff can be just material alterations. This is one that I often show people. Super classic diamond monogram, but look how different a diamond monogram can look if we've got, metallic classic gold thread versus a nice rayon thread that's here in this kind of olive color versus a variegated, zebra variegated thread. I haven't changed the design work. I haven't changed the execution necessarily. I haven't changed the material it's on. The contrast of color I did work with a little bit. And this is classic regular monogram font straight out of pre-programmed embroidered pieces, right? There's nothing more to it than that. It's just the thread that makes that alteration so powerful, right? And I think that really is something we should think about. We have that ability. I've got this piece. It was done for a tag for a brand of knitted gear, right? That's the concept. So this is a canvas tag being put on knit materials, hand knit materials. And I've got the little terms here, hand wash, dry, flat. This is done in a standard polyester thread. Very nice. Nothing wrong with it. But we want to add a little spice, right? All right. Pull down that density so that it works. Throw in a much thicker needle. And we're using 12 weight wool blend thread. And what a difference that style makes. But I didn't redesign. This is alteration. So did I do some work on the design itself? Yes. The design had to have different setups for especially density. I had to back that density off really crazy, as you can see. But the execution is just about altering the thread and doing just small amounts of technical changes to the file to make sure that that thread and needle combination would run correctly. But that's alteration. We can do a fairly minor amount of alteration, get a very different look. And we talked about some other stuff like talking about the position that something is put in, the environment. Well, here's another one. I've got a couple of this nature as well. One done here for Nob Hill Bar and Grill when they were running. And this is one where it's like, the design itself was actually something we ended up using on an apron in another style. But I will say these folks were really kind of masters. They had their own designers, and they were masters of using different vintage styles to go with their kind of ethos. And this was what we called the paratrooper badge. So we had this very paratrooper look. Pardon me if you're easily offended by the insinuation of gold nude statuettes. But yes, there is a slightly undressed lady hiding there in our paratrooper logo for the bar and grill. However, the thing that was interesting about this piece and about a couple other pieces that I did around this time was that we were running the piece off onto the mesh background. And originally, some of the people who they had dealt with really thought or felt that you could not run onto the mesh background and make a nice clean embroidery out of it. And this even has a straight stitch border around the entire piece. And as you can see, we're not seeing a lot of crazy straight stitch border popping out anywhere or a lot of distortion. We added extra pull compensation, extra underlay, and kind of worked on the way that ran so that once we got out here into this mesh, it didn't tear apart the design terribly. And that kind of unexpected placement was something that they found to be a creative way to go. So this is alteration. This original piece was used almost exactly like this, almost in the same fashion on black aprons that were used by staff. But then when they wanted to make it into merch, what was interesting, instead of just going straight, centered on where we've got that paratrooper logo dead center on the seam of this hat, we went ahead and went off center, off onto the mesh, and did something that was slightly unexpected. And when something is a little unexpected, that can be delightful, right? That's one of the things that can be delightful. And like I said, it can be as simple as material choices. There's another one that I like to show pretty frequently. Exactly the same design, no changes to the art whatsoever, no changes to the digitizing whatsoever. We've got matte finish polyester on the left-hand side. In the center, we have a standard polyester. So this is Madeira Poly Neon. And on the right-hand side, we have a full metallic. And these are all in a very similar colorway, but they have an entirely different look due to the sheen of the thread. And we can change the way a piece looks quite a lot just by altering that material. And on that same kind of note, we're talking about those positions, things like that. I'll just show you very quickly. We also have a piece that I did very early on in my career that I've shown many times. Some people joke around about this being my oldest sample, but boy, it took so much work for me to first get this that it was a massive pain. This is the same kind of thing like that Knob Hill Bar and Grill, but this is a 3D foam design with a background layer. So we've got 2 layers of dimension in it over the mesh on a mesh back trucker. Once again, just something slightly unexpected, something you might not think is technically very possible, but honestly, they are possible to do as long as you have the right stabilization, the right underlay, and honestly, in this piece, massive distortion to make sure once we had more pull out of this onto this mesh that we didn't have the border just sucking in under the lettering. But that's the thing. The combination didn't change the art. The art itself really didn't get altered. I didn't have to redraw the M80 logo to make that happen. That graffiti tag bomb pretty much stayed the same as the original piece. The interest in this case is about alteration. It's what sort of materials did I use? Where did I place it on the garment? And that's what's interesting about it more than just the art. Could you have done that piece dead center on the front of the hat? Absolutely. And it would have been pretty cool. Not a problem. Especially we have this really stark white trucker hat with this real, big, thick foam M80 on it, graffiti bomb. It's going to catch the eye, but it catches the eye even more because of the interesting placement, the interesting place you put it. And frankly, that's something that I just kind of say it's often about that environment. Where are you putting the piece and how is it working? We can even say that there's a piece from my good friend Jane Swansea where she did these peacocks. These are from a stock design. So you can also do this with a stock design. I believe this is straight out of Embroidery Library. She opened up these jeans and did cuff placements. Not for everybody, not for everything, much more of a fashion look, but these cuff placements are something you might not expect and something that if you offered as a commercial embroiderer, people might be very surprised by your willingness to do that kind of stuff. So like I said, alteration can be more than just design alteration. It can be working with different styles. So when we talk about alteration, we just have to ask ourselves, what are the things we can change here, right? We're working with thread. We can change different threads. We can change color schemes very easily. We can work with different color schemes that you might expect. We can change the environment. We can say, all right, I've got these different materials we can work with. I can work with certainly kind of contrast between the different styles of material, more sheen here, less sheen here. We could even have a shiny garment with a matte finish design. You can work that contrast any direction you want, whereas we are used to seeing a matte finish garment with a shiny design. We can work with different thicknesses of thread and just change density and not change the outlines of the actual object or logo that's being placed. So alteration doesn't always mean that. Now, we do have other things we can change that are more design focused, right? And I've got a couple of things like that just to show you very briefly. And here's just a couple that are kind of interesting. And it's just a weird thing that I did just as a proof of concept. Here is a piece originally I did a long time ago, but I've done this piece kind of a couple different times for folks. This Acanthus heart piece, I just love the look of it. It's from an old book plate. So this piece was just a classic piece of Acanthus work, very foliated, leaf-like projections out of this piece. But eventually, and I've got a couple different images of this, so hopefully I can grab the other image as well. But I think I may have 2 of them on here to show you. Let me just show you the initial image that eventually it came out to be, the actual stitch out. In doing a piece where we were talking about these creative reuses, I actually made this. Now, you can certainly harsh on me for my color choices. My color choices are rough here, and I'll say that maybe me working on this striped garment wasn't the right call, but I had to do something with a striped garment. I thought, what'd be interesting is to do a neckline piece on it. But if you look at the elements in this neckline piece, this is a ripped apart version of the heart. So if we look at this piece, and then we look back at this piece again, the individual bows that make up the heart and central pieces that are part of it, these were made into parts of this design. And those curves, those little bits that are on there are actually pieces of the heart that have been put back together as a border. So I took pieces of the design apart and then reworked it as a border. I'll try and bring up the other image that I have of the complete piece if I can find it. But it's something that, I thought was at least unique in the thought that you're like, all right, if I'm looking at the way design is put together, especially if it's something that I've done myself, that I actually have all the original pieces from, it's something that I've actually worked on and created, I can then reuse those original pieces. And once I put those together, we can change them into something that is useful to me. Even if we're working with stock designs, that's certainly something that you can do in the stock design realm, where you can pull individual pieces out, add pieces back in, and make something unique out of them. So like I said, it's not necessarily something you're going to do all the time. But even if you're working with stock designs, you're not a digitizer yourself, you can absolutely pull them apart. And actually, I'll go ahead and bring up the other image. And I did this for an article as well, where I kind of showed this piece. This is the image where I kind of showed how, if we look at this piece, this is the original concept, where there is the heart as it is in the acanthus work. But if you look at how it embroiders, each of these sides, especially from here on, these sides stitch individually, and then we jump across the other side and then stitch the other side out. By observing how it was put together, I realized that without much work whatsoever, I could split each of these sides into this individual curlicue, and it meant that I could create corner borders, I could create other elements out of it, and that eventually led me to making the final piece. So I took apart what was there, I took apart the existing elements, and then created something new out of the piece. And admittedly, is it everything I might want it to be? I'll say that on the striped shirt, in the color scheme that I went with, I think it kind of fell a little flat. However, you do see how suddenly from that original piece, I have a brand new execution that doesn't look like the original and is something that is unique. So yes, it's a simple version of that, but I think it's worthwhile to say, sometimes it's just about reimagining the piece that's in front of you in a slightly different method, and you'll find that that's going to bring out your creativity, especially if you say to yourself, I'm going to make a project with existing designs. I can do anything I want to them. Take the designs in that I love. Let's take pieces and parts out of them and recombine them and say, all right, now we have alteration and combination. What can I do in this new layout? Because I recommend everybody take some of this time to play with designs and see what that makes for them, right? It just makes that work. So it depends on how you like it, right? So it depends on how you enjoy it. But anyway, like I said, it's different for everybody. Not everybody loves it, but I do like that way, right? It kind of works. Sunrise Tactical here, you're saying it seems like embroidery on mesh looks awesome. First thought would be they wouldn't stitch out property. The thing you have to think about, if you can make something like the home embroiderers do, if you can make freestanding lace mesh. So you can make a freestanding lace. That's not how I did necessarily all those pieces. Most of those just have extra underlay and some tearaway stabilizer behind them, torn closely to the background. But if you can make, which you absolutely can, an entire embroidered piece all out of thread, and I actually have pieces probably within reach where I've made them entirely out of thread. I don't know if I've got anything currently on me. Yeah, I've got a couple pieces. This patch right here is entirely thread. You could have used wash away. I used plastic, so it's a little thicker. This piece actually, same thing, entirely made out of thread. The background's all out of thread. If you can do that, or if you can make freestanding lace work, then obviously you can also use those same construction methods to make things float out into those areas. So for sure. Barb says the OCD did not like the alteration of the tag. All right. I'll give it to you. If you don't like it, hey, use the other type. You could go the other direction. Make something fuzzy into something much more smooth, shiny. All of that's available to you. That's the cool thing about it. Ron says block editing and duplication. Cool. Absolutely. Look at the designs you have in existence and tear them apart. You'd be surprised how resilient some of that stuff is, or pieces you've already made. The great thing is you can also make complementary design elements out of stuff you already have. Let's say we have a logo design that has some sort of element that is attached to it. We have a letter block, a small logo that then is attached to a text block. Go ahead and do that on the left chest. Then blow up that logo block and put it dead center on the front of a hat or in an offside position. Put that somewhere else in the logo. Throw it on a sleeve. Put it on a yoke right in the back under the neck. Put it on a hip placement. And now you have something interesting that you can do with an existing part of that design. And even in a commercial space, you can make something more interesting. Let's just say we have like a regular kind of logo setup where it's something, it's a logo with some text under, text next to it. Grab that logo, pull it apart, offer the concept of throwing that on a sleeve so that you have this additional kind of marketing of that logo. And if you want to go further, we can do additions. We talked about expansion, right? What are the other things we can do about expansion? We can add additional material placements. You can get woven labels or woven loop tags that you can sew on borders of garments, on the cuff of a knit beanie. You can get additional materials and add them to the pieces. And at the very easiest version, we can embroider portions of an existing logo in another location. We expand the area of coverage to some degree, right? We expand the number of decorations, and that's something that's interesting in and of itself. But Cindy King says, I love to use all elements of a collection. So fun to mix and match things and create a whole new look. Absolutely. Absolutely. Also, to use things in ways they weren't originally intended. Remember, even with an existing stitch file design, if you don't process it out where you can set densities, now sometimes reprocessing doesn't work very well, you can blow things up the amount that it would take for the densities to open up. So I know this sounds weird. I've done this both directions. I've used something for 40 weight thread and used it on 75 weight thread by shrinking it without changing the spacing between the lines of thread. And I've also used something for 12 weight thread by blowing it up without changing the spacing, and then ran everything in the 12 weight thread. You can do that because remember, all density is a measurement of space between lines of thread. So if we change the spacing between those lines, we change density. And if we need more or less density and we're okay with the size of the logo itself changing, we can then use those threads without necessarily altering the design at all, even with stock designs. Even with stock designs, it's all about measurement and understanding your materials and your methods, right? That's the way to do it, folks. That's the different way to handle it. But in any case, we have all these different methods and different ways to recombine things. So let's talk about some other stuff, right? So we're talking about those alterations as combinations, as expansions. We'll go with a couple other things that are alteration that I think are interesting, or at least pieces out of my collection, just to kind of show you that I think let you kind of get this concept of how we go from one thing to the next, how we add an additional layer of creativity to things without necessarily changing the design, though certainly design can be part of it. But we'll jump in a few other things. Like I've also said to you guys before, sometimes the best thing to do is self-directed projects that are for you, like my weird little Viking Age stuff you see here, like the different kind of logo stuff I've done for testing materials, like the shop shirts. I worked at a place called Black Duck, so you're going to see frequently pieces that show the Black Duck logos on them, and that's something where you can kind of get an idea about, we were using different materials and trying things out, and in trying things out and using these different materials, we actually end up showing some new techniques, and that's the stuff. We can sometimes add something additional. In this case, here is a piece where I used a wash away thick topping. It's something that washes away but leaves the thread proud of the design. So it's not 3D foam. It washes out after you use it. But we used that extra dimension to create something interesting. In this case, I was looking at both kind of varsity type work and seals. So things like seals, postage stamps, the things you would use for like notarizing a garment or a document. And I thought, how can I make like seals and university seals and that kind of work, plus our original logo, the origami duck logo that you're seeing in the center here is part of that. And how can I make that more interesting? Well, I have a couple different things. Thing is, this is fairly stock text. This is fairly easy curved fills with borders. We have a nice light, low density fill inside of the outer ring that we're using to get some more textural interest. And we can kind of see, so light, low density fills here. It's not a bunch of additional embroidery. Standard densities and everything else. We have this rippled satin stitch border on the outside. And we can see it looks a little rough. That's intentional. It's distressed with that wash away material that washes out. And I'll actually show you another close-up of it so you can kind of see some of the dimension, how much it sticks up. You can see that it's sitting above the ground of the material. This piece was essentially done, like I said, it's a shop shirt. It was a test for this material. But when we show this to the customer, when we show this to someone we're working with, they don't know what we can do and they don't know what they don't know. This is why we are here to guide them, right? And in this case, the great thing about that is we're actually ending up with this really interesting look. But if we think about it in a design method, this is really alteration. This is not much different from flat design, especially because this isn't 3D foam. It's using a wash away material. I don't have caps. And unfortunately, my cursors were not really showing, but I don't have caps at the end of these satins. I don't have to have specialty stitches that are holding this together. And also the density does not have to be super high like we would use to cut foam. So in this case, we put on this wash away material at the top. It does require garment washing, so that's something that not all customers are into. But once it rinses away, we get this look kind of high presentation. We get this extra kind of ability to show that piece, to have that real height in the piece. But the thing is, the original logo, not very much changed. This is made from original vector art that we used for other applique materials. So we have these borders, not very hard to do, converted direct from vector. This is pretty much standard collegiate text and a very small amount of digitizing to make the outer ring. And we get, out of not too much stitching, a pretty large centerpiece on a sweatshirt that's pretty interesting and has that additional texture. And this could be done with somebody's existing logo. The only thing I had to really change here is I had to have a stop and do the flat elements first before putting down the material so I could stitch the rest of the elements in for the wash and, of course, to wash the garment. So is there more input to this piece? Absolutely. But would I find this to be like egregiously difficult to alter from an existing piece? Absolutely not. You could take a very similar piece that had just text inside of a border and only put that puffed material under the text pre-washout, and you would get a pretty interesting look. And that's the thing. We're also talking about taking it as inspiration. When I was doing those pieces, I also started looking for different ways I could showcase it. The original material was called Q104. And this is one of the other ways I showcased it. I wanted this super Art Deco look. So what I do, I checked out Art Deco stuff, found some really cool fonts that fit with the Art Deco ethos. And then this little kind of wheat on seashell thing, we've got this little wheat stalk that's on this seashell kind of background. This is actually from a metal grill that was in an old school elevator from the 20s. I found this image of that metal grill and I put it together with these light contour stitches. So you'll see that I've got this like super light contour stitching. And then we have the, on top of it, we have a fuller density of the satin stitching, at least for this individual piece. We've got some carving in that wheat, but it's really light contour. We get this difference in density from the top to the bottom almost for free because a normal contour column stitch is going to be looser when the column is wider and tighter when the column is narrower. We added those things in with a layer of the puff material for that Q104 monogram that goes last, and we get dimension and texture, and it's really not a ton of additional materials. It's about taking those different things that we're inspired by and putting together and using the thread for what it's good for. You know, understanding what the thread does best and taking different inspirations. I mean, I look at some of these other pieces that we talk about, you know, this is a very technical or a very honestly hand embroidery kind of inspired piece rather than a technical piece. This peacock feather has been used in multiple different ways. I'm actually going to show you a way a good friend of mine used it. It's a stock design of mine that's over on the Only Stitch, but this piece has feather stitching, very classic feather stitching motif, something that most software would have. I made a custom one for myself, but that's really all there is. There's this feather stitching motif with some just interspersed. This is just straight stitches of two different colors in the background and some radial fills that are making up the central head of that feather. And so I'm taking inspirations from hand stitching, from old school hand stitching, and bringing them into machine embroidery. But that's not new, but it's something interesting. Then you go and see what my good friend Carolyn Cagle did with it. She made these hats and these mittens out of this that she did for kind of commercial. She was doing commercial mitten making and mitten work. And she went with this wild color scheme on this plaid. Look at that crazy color scheme. So her alteration in this case is just to take that existing piece. You saw what the original color scheme was. Super classic peacock colors. So the original color scheme is like this. This is what we were looking for. So that's the original color scheme as I put it together, as I directed it in the color changes. We get into what Carolyn does, and she uses this super wild color scheme on these kind of woolen gloves. And then she goes even further in recombining it with different styles. And hopefully I can track this down. I put too many things in here to show you. Here's another version of another picture of it where she put it on a rough cut piece of that applique on the hat. So appliqued the hat, the material on the hat with the design, rough cut, frayed on purpose, wild color scheme, and used the pattern behind it to enhance or to increase that kind of design focus, so to show that piece and have it look a little wild, look a little loud. So I think that's pretty interesting. You know, part of the thing is just using the materials you have. And that really goes back into combination. It's not just alteration, it's also combination. How can I combine these disparate elements into something interesting? How can I take two different things that aren't quite the same and make them into something new? And also expansion. What did she do? We've got a coordinated garment. She's using it on the mittens. Certainly she could have used a different piece or something else that was similar on the other piece, but we're using it to make coordinated garments. Instead of just using it in one position, maybe just making that hat, we now have a mitten set that goes with it and enhances the value. That's expansion. So when we talk about expansion, we're just saying, all right, what can we add, right? So like we've talked about before, right? We talked about alteration first. Alteration was what can we change? If we're doing a combination, it's what can we bring together, right? So different stylistic cues. Maybe we bring in a new color scheme for something that exists. We bring in multiple designs and literally sandwich those together, different elements from designs and put them together. We talk about what can we add then for expansion. What is the expansion portion? What can we add to this existing design? Maybe we have multimedia, and I'm going to show you some more multimedia stuff in a minute. In this case, I would consider Carolyn's piece multimedia, because if we look at that piece again, I would obviously say that's multimedia by the time that I'm using this rough cut applique, distressed applique up here for the hat. That's a multimedia piece to me. Certainly, that's the thing, is we think about multimedia as only being like full color prints with embroidery. And certainly I've got some of those that I've done and some that I've shown in May Show today. But multimedia can be as simple as a very simple applique piece like this. And I've got some pieces that I've done like this in a commercial space, believe it or not. In selling directly to schools was really where I did the rough cut applique. And once again, to the real estate market, because that particular real estate market liked to have more flashy garments that weren't things being pitched to them by other standard producers who are working for the rest of the real estate market. Their particular company and their particular events happen to have a flavor of that kind of school spirit type event. And if we have that flavor and that's important to the customer, we should be able to provide that. We provide that flavor. We provide that type of experience for them, even if it doesn't traditionally match with the kind of stuff that's expected. If we go and just do carbon copy office casual, because that's usually what we want for that kind of people, Sure, is it something they used? Yes, most of the work we did for them was office casual. The stuff that we sold on their company website, by and large, the most of it was the stuff that you would expect a realtor to come wearing to your house. However, we had an entire segment of stuff that you would wear either off the clock, at the gym, or for these events. And especially when we sold directly at the events, that was more about their spirit and style, where they had a unique flavor, right? Their company had a unique culture. We were attaining that style, bringing it forward, adding it into our product line. And that unique culture became part of why we were the selection for them. And also built those tests, built that trust as we brought those tests. So it's just one of those things, right? It just depends on how you work on that stuff. It just depends. So anyway, we've got a couple of things going on here. Certainly, Patty B says, what's your secret to such crisp lettering? Crisp lettering for me, a lot of that has to do with just control of texture. So this means that if we're using the right needles, certainly, but for me, most of the time, that's still going to be just the RG point. I'm not trying to go crazy with that one. If I'm on something that is super, super coarse, I'll use a sharp point. But really, a lot of it is using underlay with the proper insets, using the correct densities, certainly making sure you're not overly dense or under dense, but underlay to hold in edges when we need that, especially on wider satin stitches. And also, if we've got a lot of texture, topping. Believe it or not, if we've got a bunch of texture or a fair amount of texture, using a water-soluble topping, everybody talks about Solvay, but whatever your thin film topping is on texture, it can hold the stitches above that fabric before they start to sink in. And before they start sinking in, and even though we're going to wash that out, it will hold them and let them form, let the loop form and lay down on that flat surface before it washes away. And it does help with some crispness to the lettering. But certainly, underlay, edge run underlay on wide columns, make sure that inset's far enough that it's not popping out, and just watch your densities, watch your stitch angles as well. If your stitch angles get too kind of oblique, like here's our sides of our column, when we start getting really way far off, you want most of your stitch angles to be fairly perpendicular. They start getting really oblique in the corners, you can actually get further spacing apart. You'll get lower density on the outside edge of those, and sometimes you may have to work with multiple stitch angles on satin stitches to try and keep those tight in the corners. So that's what I'll say for that. Proper materials. If you're on something super coarse, then use a sharp. If it's like a canvas bag and you got to get some sharper edges, then you might want to work with that. Supportive underlay and topping for stuff that has texture can absolutely help that as well. All right. So Shabazz says, hello, everyone watching from Pakistan. Hey, thank you for tuning in. Love it. And we've got Frank coming in from Halifax, Nova Scotia. Thank you for being here, Frank. Cindy says, who would have ever thought people would be using chenille letter jacket patch as a cap patch, small size, of course? Absolutely. That is a combination, a style that you might not think, but it's not outside of the realm of possible, especially if you're somebody who is already doing a lot of patch caps and you've got a post-bed machine and you are hand sewing patch or caps on patches. Why not a chenille patch? I know it's super heavy, super big. It's got felt on it. Seems kind of crazy. I've also done a felt applique on patches way back in the day, and everybody was looking at me like I was crazy when I first did it because the felt applique at the time wasn't a thing. I got inspired and my customer got inspired by vintage applique and vintage patches that were kind of like old militaria, old sports patches back when a lot of the cut lettering that was on like varsity gear and sports gear really early, it used to be felt more than twill. We're so used to twill cuts, like poly twill cuts, but back in the day we had a wool felt. So that's one of those things, right? That's one of the things that can be part of it, is getting inspired. So like I said, Anton says hello from Romania. Anton, thank you for being here. Love having people from all over the world. I appreciate it. And Frank says there's another Frank. Yeah, Frank in the UK is out there. Multiple Franks, folks. And that's the thing. It really just depends, right? It really depends. But anyway, lots of folks going on, doing cool stuff. Patty says, thank you. Absolutely. We'll talk more technical stuff later. I just wanted to do some fun, creative stuff today, especially because of the cool stuff I got up to this morning. But let's talk about some other stuff too. Anyway, let's talk about some other stuff. We had some other concepts, right? Let's go back. We had alteration, combination, expansion, and constrictions. We talked about a lot of the different versions of stuff that we're here. We're running a little longer than we usually do, but I wanted to kind of talk about some of that, especially constrictions. That's something that we haven't talked about a lot, right? We're saying, hey, alteration, change some things. Combination, bring some different styles together, some color schemes together, some different materials together that you might not expect. Expansion, add some different locations, throw something extra on. I mean, certainly I want to talk more about that because I'm going to go into some multimedia. But the fun thing is, even when we're doing these things, even if we're altering, even if we're combining different things, even if we're expanding and adding more elements, I think we always want to put constrictions on our work. And why is this? Because I think for most of us, the worst time we have as people in design, as designers of embroidery, as people who are helping customers to do design as well, even if they're bringing in designs and asking for our kind of input, or we're trying to help them make something cool, make something new. You know, you've had that customer who says, hey, you know what's cool, I trust you, or you know what can be done, show me what's going on. If we go with a full blank page and with all of the world of stuff that's possible out there, the chances are we're going to get flummoxed, we're going to freeze, because there's all of these opportunities. We could go in any direction. The thing is, there's two problems we have. You can go in any direction, but you can't go in every direction. You got to pick a lane to some degree. The more we add, the more complexity we add, we have to get paid more because it's going to take us more time and probably have more input. Though I often say that you can get more value and more looks out of something without necessarily adding stitch counter materials. But it will take more creative input for us at the very least. And sometimes we've got budgetary constrictions from our customer. So we need to put those constrictions in place, not just because we have real constrictions, like the customer has a budget to work from and they're not looking for some of this extraneous material if we're trying to add more creative stuff to it, but also because sometimes we get stuck on that blank page and we're not rolling. So the two problems are you can't go every direction and that you can't steer a parked car. So sometimes we don't want to go in any direction because we're getting confused by all these different things we could possibly do. And in order to get us moving, even if we're going to make a mistake on the way, we can't change the direction we're going until we pick a direction and start to move. And frankly, sometimes with this kind of creative work, it takes a little bit of testing, feeling things out, trying different versions, and arriving at that final version that we're really excited about. And that means that we have to put some constrictions and say, all right, I'm going to spend a certain amount of time. I'm going to put this much together. I'm going to use this much as far as colorway. And in fact, that's the thing. We say, what can we reduce? What can we remove? What can we take away from that initial blank page? And so we reduce things and pull that back to something that's focused, that helps us get to the creation step. And that can be really simple. I mean, sometimes it can be as simple as saying, I'm reducing the colors. I'm going to use no more than, 7 to 9 colors on this piece unless I absolutely need them. So we're going to go ahead and say that's the amount of threads that I have, and I'm not using any more than that. So what can we do with that? What can I do with 3 colors? How about that? I want to use 3 colors. And I did an episode about reduced low color single color pieces. I've done it about reduced stitch counts, and that's another thing. Reduce the stitch count. I am not going to have this thing have any more than this much run time. This thing is going to have 18,000 stitches, and that's it, whether it's a full coverage chest or not. And I'm going to have to figure out how to make 18,000 stitches do the job. That is another kind of interesting thing we can do. Can we change as we go? Yes. Every time I say this, somebody goes, well, what if we need 20? Then use 20. This is a tool to help you focus. This is not something that is not a rule that when you break it, you lost. If you make something cool, the customer likes it, and you're getting paid enough, all good. Okay, we did the right thing. You've won. Victory. It's not a problem. The thing that we're trying to do is help ourselves get moving onto this new kind of process or onto this new creative product. We can reduce the amount of detail. Just say, hey, yeah, we're going to do it, but instead of including everything that's in this design, I'm going to focus in on this character. I'm going to focus in on this motto, focusing on this logo type. I'm going to focus in on the outlines of this element, this car, this building. I'm going to focus in on a certain portion of this thing and make that the star of this design instead of everything else that's in the original art that was brought to me, right? I'm going to reduce the amount of detail and make it functional for embroidery, but also just reduce what's in there. I'm not going to take away things that aren't important to the customer and I'm going to talk to the customer about what those things are. So we can do all of that. And we can do things like reducing space. Say, I'm only going to do a small design. How do I get the most impact out of this small design? That's also possible. There is the entire era of the dad hat. If you guys don't remember, the floppy dad hat and the classic dad hat had a little tiny icon of a design that was like less than 2 inches square. It was more like an inch square, these little bitty icon designs. And if you were going to make a classic dad hat, you had to express whatever it was you were trying to express in that space and to hit that style. And the thing is, people didn't not buy those. When they were popular, they bought those. They didn't then complain that it didn't have enough area in it because that was what they were looking for. The style, the brief, the constrictions you were on, that you were working with was, I need a logo on a low profile, soft crown hat that is this big and has this particular image or something like that involved. And that constriction, working in that small space, was something that you had to do to successfully fulfill the brief, right? To fulfill the request, to fulfill the determination of what this thing is supposed to look like. The thing we sometimes do is we ourselves, especially we forget the audience or forget what we're creating is more important than what our initial feelings about it. Like if we won't wear it, somehow it's not good. We will sometimes forget that the judgment call is not on us as decorators. The judgment call is on the person who is purchasing it, the person who is wearing it, whether they like it. And though I love to see us bring in our own personal inspirations, especially when we're making things to showcase our techniques, that ultimately the design brief, the thing you're working toward, the goal you have, the success condition is about who's going to wear the final piece, who's going to purchase the final piece, and how does that make them feel? Do they identify with it? Do they want it on their person? Does it say something to the world around them about who they are? And does it improve their feelings about themselves, the way that they present themselves to the world, or make them feel good in some other fashion? And I know that sounds so touchy-feely, but we don't make fully logical decisions about these things, especially when we're talking about decorated apparel, stuff we're putting on our body where we're identifying ourselves, unless it is literally, here's my company logo and it's on because it's a uniform. It's required by law that I have my licensure number on it. And that's what it's here for, unless it's that entirely. And even when it is, part of the pleasure of wearing that is, does it look cool? Do I like to identify with it? Is it something that I would wear even if I didn't have to? That's going to increase that value for the person, even if their base need is very logical. We use emotional reasoning to kind of decide whether we like this stuff, and especially when it's something creative, when it's something a little farther off. So you have to remember, we're not the massive audience. But that's the cool thing, is that can add constrictions. But even when you're making something for yourself, I really think adding constrictions can absolutely help. You say, this is what I have to work with. What will I do with that? If I put those constrictions on myself of what I'm allowed to use, how much material I'm going to use, what kind of garment I'm going to work on, what kind of area I'm going to decorate in, the number of stitches, anything that it takes to get you starting to be a problem solver rather than a daydreamer, it can help you to start working toward the final goal. And I'll talk about some of those kind of constrictions, and we'll even look at some samples and talk about this stuff as well. But I think it's just something to say, if you're finding yourself, pie in the sky, you've got all these things that you're inspired by and you can't decide what to create, stop and say, even to the point of just constricting your time, say, I'm only going to spend an hour on the design portion of this. I'm not going to work any further than that. I'm not going to do anything else to it. By the end of that hour, I need to have a really good idea of where I'm headed. And just say, at the end of that hour, I'm going to try and solidify that idea, and that's what I'm going with. Truth being told, you're probably not going to work the hour. You're going to get past it, but trying to reduce the amount of time you futz around will help you to stop chasing perfect and land on the good. Perfect is the enemy of the good, because if you keep chasing perfect, you're going to spend 80% of your effort trying to get the last 10% of the finish. And it can be much better to go ahead and make something, even if your initial work fails, even if you don't love that initial piece, and keep working from there. I think that's just a great plan, right? You work from that. So in that case, it's just something you can work with. And I think it's kind of useful. It's just something to look into. Try and constrict yourself and say, this is what I'm working with. And I'll show you a couple pieces where I did some just kind of basic, interesting kind of constrictions. This is a piece that I did for a magazine cover. And this one, I called it the fleur-de-lis ancestor. The entire design came out of the initial outlay. This is not a custom rhinestone piece. The rhinestone transfer that was used for this piece, the original rhinestone transfer, was provided to me as a finished rhinestone piece, but what they wanted was a multimedia design. So in creating the multimedia design, I thought, all right, I want to include embroidery in the piece, but the embroidery has to be fairly light. I need to be sure that it's not going to tear up this type of garment. And I have to make sure that it's something that fits in with the existing piece. Now, the one thing I did alter, there were more stones inside of the center of this transfer. So what did I do for alteration? What can I change? I took out the stones inside of the center kind of leaf out of the fleur-de-lis. I took some of those stones away so that I had more open area. And then I kind of did some research. I'm like, all right, well, what's the inspiration for the fleur-de-lis? And depending on who you talk to and who you look for, they're saying, all right, the fleur-de-lis is really supposed to represent, an iris or a lily or something. And I said, oh, an iris. I'm like, wow, it's a really interesting shape. So I checked out some botanical illustrations. I'm like, let's look at some cool illustrations of these irises. And I found one that I thought had a layout that looked very similar to the fleur-de-lis. And then I made this piece, this light stitching piece, super light densities. We're not seeing actually a bunch of shading. Most of that is in the same yellow, just with different spacing inside of those pieces. And then I heat pressed, after the embroidery is done, the existing transfer on the top. So this is alteration of the transfer, combination of two elements, inspiration from different places, and constriction. It has to work on this garment. It has to be multimedia, and I have to use the transfer that was provided to me in order to make this piece work. So that's constriction working alongside with alteration and expansion and everything else. I would say expansion isn't as much a part of this, aside from the fact that I just did literally add two types of decoration together. And that's the thing. Some of these different things can come together and be interesting. Another constriction, you guys have seen me talk about this one before, Gilly Loco design that we did for jacket backs. This one really came down to the fact that I had to make like 24 jackets very quickly for a gathering for the people who ran this salsa company. And literally, I wasn't going to have time to create something new. The design had lots of interesting texture, but in the original piece that was done for a left chest, we didn't communicate all of that texture that was there. And once we moved it to the jacket back, I didn't want a fully filled logo because we didn't have time to stitch it. And I didn't want to add all that extra detail I had to digitize. So what did we do? We used classic applique, and then we used a upholstery material that had kind of a faux crocodile finish inside of it, so that we got this really interesting texture. And that was kind of free texture that didn't come with having to digitize it. And what I don't want to tell you is, I started from my original left chest and did a bunch of alteration to the design from the left chest. Can you do it all the time? Absolutely not. Can I see things that I'd probably do differently in this piece? Yes. The other constriction is working with this super rubbery material. You'll see that some of these areas that are inside the tail are filled in instead of using a cut out gap. We have a black fill on top. Why is that? That super rubbery material has a tendency to stretch. I had to have a lot of slop, and cutting a little curly Q out of that material would have been brutal and probably wouldn't have laid very flat. So the technical nature of the material was a restriction that I had to work with. This one that I've shown before, having to make a piece that covers with a very light stitch count because we had a customer or a company that was sponsoring bail out, and they suddenly had to pay for making jacket back designs by themselves. Use some contour pieces to make that balloon. Talked about that really recently. These kinds of things, these constrictions can be interesting and help us to make interesting new pieces, right? And some of these pieces certainly have other kind of methodologies I worked. This is another one that I did, and this was really illustrative. This Hanya mask is done in one color of metallic thread. I made it in order to show folks how the difference in stitch angle, stitch type, texture, and length can change just how different that color looks. And we got shading and dimension out of that one color of thread. And my constriction for this was no shading, no second colors, no outlines. All of this has to be done with the dimension of the thread. Now, it was very intentional. It was done specifically to illustrate that for people. But that's the thing. The inspiration was originally a photograph of a real no mask, a Hanya mask. It's a Japanese theater thing. So that actual wooden no mask was the only art that I used. I went directly from the photograph to this. Does the photograph look like this? Not really. The outside shapes and everything are there, but I took cues from that photograph and my understanding of stitch types to create this piece with the constriction that I was only using a single color of thread so as to show how those pieces work, right? That's one of those things. And sometimes it can come in ways you don't expect. This particular piece was a piece I did for, there was a contest where they wanted to do like eco-friendly. And one of the reasons people were doing eco-friendly stuff, they were using all kinds of eco-friendly materials. But my concept was eco-friendly also means reusing damaged garments. And in this case, I had really high end. They were eco-friendly pigment dyed tees and they had holes in them. And I found, I'm like, all right, well, they have holes in them. Let's make big holes. I did reverse applique using two different colors of garment dyed tees. I've got a second jersey knit applique that's on the reverse of this piece. This one is hand cut. You could do this with laser. You could do this with other ways. In this case, it was hand cut because it was done as an example piece. If I were doing a ton of these, I'd probably sub them out to somebody who had better tools than I had. At this point, though, it was me just saying, all right, what can I do with this damaged garment? Put another layer of the same kind of material in a different color underneath it. Use a very light kind of back stitching that still has some thickness and some straight stitches. Then use a chain on the outside edge and cut it out for a reverse applique design where these expensive tees still get used. Now, is that a lot of labor? Yes. Will every company go for that? No. If you show this to multiple companies, somebody might go for it. And at the very least, they will trust you with that creative work. So those are some constrictions and just some different inspirations, right? Inspiration can come from anywhere, and constrictions can help you to get your work done. I have to reuse that garment. The area that has a hole in it is in this spot. I have these materials to work with. What can I do with a low stitch count? Because I know that I'm going to have a ton of handwork in the cutting, and I don't want this thing to be completely, out of pocket. Now, like I said, is it perfect? No. Is it something I would do with every commercial design? No. But we did use something similar in commercial work. That design helped to lead us to further commercial work down the road. We've got some other interesting stuff here. I mean, there's constrictions like this where you're just like, if I'm working on super diaphanous material, then I have to use light embroidery. And I did here self-wound stuff. We have monograms on it that have really light densities with lovely kind of shiny thread using a limited length or auto split kind of satin stitch on it. But that's more about material limitations. That's not something I'm imposing on myself, but it can be. But that same piece I showed you earlier led to this, which was actually a final commercial piece. And this is a multimedia print. So what can we add? We're using multimedia. In this case, for a prep school, they wanted an old school looking kind of distressed logo for their mascot. We did that in a flock that had some distressing in the print. And then we hand cut after stitching that custom made chain stitch motif. And we hand cut a rough applique in the shape of this SP. This, instead of the reverse applique is fiddly. You have to be careful not to cut both layers. This piece, they're like, yes, we want it distressed. Yes, we want it rough. You could cut it very sloppily and it looked good. And this was actually done. We did a couple of boxes of these suckers. So we're talking about a decent size order. And we did these hand cuts and they paid enough for us to do that and have our people who usually have in trimming and finishing do this hand cutting. So like I said, they can lead to commercial work. And some of these changes don't have to be crazy. These are pretty crazy changes. These are pretty crazy alterations, but they don't always have to be that crazy. I mean, sometimes it is, like I said, the change of the thread. Top thread on this is rayon. The bottom thread on this is matte finish polyester. If we look at these pieces, they actually, each one of these R's has the same amount of stitches in it. So it's no more time on the machine. It's literally a multi-pass satin. So each one of the perpendicular bars has multiple stitches in the same position and a small connector stitch. And it's a change in density and the automatic setting of roughness, feathering, or jaggedness, depending on what software you have on the edges. So we could do text with the same vector art, with the same font that looks like what we have on the right, looks wild and ragged and crazy. And it's the same amount of effort as doing the text on the left. And if we want to change it even more, we can change the sheen of the thread. And these are both threads that run in the same needle. Though the matte finish thread does run thinner, it looks more like something in between a 40 and a 60 weight. These up here being 40 weight in the rayon, these are running in the same needle, so no changes really have to happen, or at least not much of a change. Maybe tension if you started seeing problems. Honestly, on a distressed piece, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Between the rayon and the poly. So even switching the threads didn't necessarily cost us anything. This is an experiment in thought. This is how can we use specialty stitching? I mean, sometimes it will cost. Sometimes the stuff does require more work, does require more materials. If we do the stuff like I showed you earlier, this is another piece with that wash away, the lotus and ohm, where the lotus is done in really light stitching in the background in those contours, whereas the ohm is done on top of that wash away foam style material. You absolutely can do interesting stuff with that, and it looks pretty great. That does take more material. That does take garment washing. That's real, you know. Sometimes it's actually less. This is a version of that same iris from the fleur de lis piece, and we can see that carefully, you know, kind of rendered in a smaller piece. What we can see is a lot of the changes between the darker coloring and the more saturated coloring are just brought in by that contour stitching and the openness thereof. So there's a little bit of shading, but not a ton. And so we get more dimension kind of for free, if you want to call it that, right? You can do some interesting stuff with that. And like I said, that's just stuff where it doesn't necessarily cost more. It can just be a thread change, and some threads are very similar. And like I said, it can be just using custom stitches. If you saw my piece on doing rough pieces here, this is that same thing I did with a custom motif combined with essentially a stippling, a quilting pathway. So very easy, like 3 clicks in my software once I had all the settings together to go from any letter to something that looks like that. And this one actually has a rougher, fuzzy spun polyester thread. So using the different stitch types, using the different colors. Then I had one of the viewers, which, and I'm not going to share names unless somebody pops in, shared this with me. They were trying to get a nice gradient. They went ahead and sublimated on white thread. So this was done ahead of time. And on the black material, you can be a little sloppier, and sublimated the white thread that's in the text. And I've seen that done in multiple locations. I've actually got another piece up here from Tom Farr from Buzzards Bay that I've showed for many years. I've shown it off and on. I think I've got that in here too. If not, I can show it another time. But he did the same thing with 3D foam, white thread, and then used sublimation, because white polyester thread will take sublimation quite well. Unfortunately, I don't think I threw it in my stack today, but yeah, it's another possibility. And then you think about just other simple materials too. This was a piece that I did as a giveaway for Embrilliance. I made these patches that you can resize and use as you like. I drew these myself. So I sketched these little guys, these little scullies, and made like a set of kind of emojis that were based on those little skull shapes for Halloween patches, mostly for kiddos and kids at heart who like a cute skull, right? Because I draw skulls for no particular good reason. But the cool thing was Lisa Shaw, who's my compatriot over there, made a couple different versions of it. One of them, glowing thread. What better for a Halloween piece than a piece of glow in the dark? And boy, did that ever make a huge difference to the final look. And the other cool thing she did, she put a layer of Mylar inside this piece. So she did a layer of Mylar that's super shiny inside of that low stitch count background for the patch. So all she had to do is lay it down. This is not hard. Lay it down, tear it off. And so sometimes you get these really low stitch count treatments that can really change the look. So it's all about kind of knowing that stuff. What is it that is possible that we can create? Pardon me real quick. We have to let ourselves play. We have to let ourselves get inspired. So I think I'm going to pull this down, just talk a little bit about getting inspired real quick, and also answer a couple of the last comments that we have here before we start finishing up for the day. Honestly, my throat's about to go. So unless you want to listen to me cough for the rest of the show, we might have to stop here shortly. So Ron says, how about running 2 threads through the same needle for a poor man's variegated thread look? I've done it. I'll say the problem with that is, even if you get your tensions all right on the poor man's variegated thread, do remember that if one breaks, your needle sensors aren't going to catch that. So you're going to be watching like a hawk. Is cool. Can make cool looks. What I like instead, in fact, I think I do have before I move on to this other shape here, this other piece I wanted to show you, the other kind of inspirations. What I like is, if you can see here, in these metallics. Things like this super twist that's here. This is a Madeira super twist. There's a couple of variegated metallics here. They also occur in non-metallics. You can get variegated threads like that are just, I think, a much better way to roll. Just because of the hassle. I mean, do I like the look of running 2 threads? The other thing you can do, if you're going to do that, run your fills in half density and then fill another half density of the other thread right on top and blend them. That's another way to do it. Just offset it slightly by that stitch point, both half densities, run them together. The other cool thing you can do that unfortunately I don't have a sample of here before, I've done water before that sparkled by loosening up the top density of the water with some curved fills and using an underlay of metallic thread so that the underlay just peeked out a little bit. Instead of being completely in the fill, you saw little picks and points of the shiny underlay under the top stitching. Remember that we have all of these things we can work with, and you'll get really cool kind of concepts, right? It is just the portion of your brain that says do it the same way has to be shut off for a minute, and you just say, what is possible? What is possible without causing problems? Because that's the thing. You don't think of underlay as decorative, but if you had super light top stitching and you let the underlay show on purpose, you can use the underlay as a decorative element. Why not? People that I talked to originally when I first did my kind of work with custom motifs, I did them to make patch edges back in the day. I made a lot of custom motifs for stuff like that. But then when I started using custom motifs and also very handwork-like stitches like back stitches and cross stitches and whip stitches and feather stitches in my commercial work, they were like, man, what are you trying to do with that stuff? And like I said, it was something where it might not have originally been thought of, especially not by a commercial guy. Oh, let me show you this again since I found it. This is that sublimation. So here you have white polyester thread over 3D foam and then heat pressed with a sublimation all over. Cool stuff from Buzzards Bay. So that's the thing to think about. Or stuff like the pixel setup. Can you fill with little pixels of 90-degree changed satin stitches? Absolutely you can. Is it a bit of a pain getting the line up nice on the bottom, on the edges? Absolutely it is, but does it make a really cool look to the final piece? Yeah, absolutely. And like I was showing earlier, using different motifs, filling a monogram with 2 sets of bevels made up of whip stitch satins that run at angles. You can make something cool with that stuff. I mean, there are really all of these opportunities. Now, some of them are hard to do. This takes more digitizing to split a letter into multiple pieces to make that work. Each stroke had to be made out of 2 satin stitches. So it wasn't the perfect answer for me. At least it took a little more time than you might have liked out of it. However, we look at some of the other elements that I've shown, like this piece, where this really is taking a vector letter of the right size and shape, adding a stippling run to it, and then adding a custom motif that follows the stippling run, and that's it. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean more effort to get more creative. It's just breaking out of the traditional ways things are filled. Even this piece that I've shown you guys many a time before really was about constrictions more than expansion. It's like, how do I get these stock garments that are going into a department store? We need to run these sweatshirts. We can't put a lot of stitching on them in order to make our money back on these pieces, but they have to have some cool Americana vibes. And I was like, all right, cool. Let's let the density, the thickness of the sweatshirt material stand up high out of the open letters, and we'll just use a tiny amount of stitching to intimate the flag that's in the background, and we'll get that extra dimension out of the sweatshirt itself. We get the puff out of the sweatshirt, not out of the embroidery. We use negative space. We use just the bare amount, and the difference between the raw kind of rough look of the sports gray, this dappled gray, this knit material that's going to be fuzzy, and the shine of the embroidery to produce even more contrast. It's about that kind of creative thinking. And I think each one of us is possible to do that. And looking at inspiration, say, hey, why not a hat that has a lasered piece of loop so you can put any patch you want to with a hook? This is something done for NASA. How cool is that? And then we can swap patches out on it, and we have a decorated area of loop. You can also do this, and I've seen it done, by embroidering through the loop section, just not so much that it won't stick to the hook section behind the patches. You do a tonal embroidery right here through that loop and leave that there for when they don't have a patch attached. What a cool way to make a patch hat. And I've got some that I'm working with myself. I really love this concept. Or just using envelope warping on text. This is a piece that I've done for an upcoming project. And this is my karma ran over my dogma. It's a goofy slogan, but I wanted to get in on all the psychedelic text. And I know that the tools we have in Brilliance and Stitch Artist, we have a true graphical envelope, very much like you would have from like Corel Draw or any of the other graphic softwares, any of the stuff like from Affinity. And those vector software style envelopes are unique. So I thought, man, that's something we should try. I should use those envelopes and warp some keyboard text and make fonts that work for it. Or this piece where I'm just like, hey, I've got this cool 12-weight cotton thread. I want to make a piece that looks like knit, but it's put on with an embroidery machine. How can I do it? Well, multiple strokes of that thread in one area, like a bean stitch, will stack up. And if I make these little V's that look like the front of an intarsia knit, now I've got this cool knitwork. I did that years ago, and I've done a couple pieces since in the kind of that ugly sweater, the ugly Christmas sweater type motif. The thing is, we have to find ways to get ourselves kind of inspired. So very briefly, I'm going to pull this down and bring up some inspirational stuff, and then we'll just get going and just kind of give you a flavor for the kind of stuff I'm talking about and the things that I do. I often do that retail research. I look at what's in the stores. I look at what's going on out there, and I look at current things that are happening kind of in the in that world of fiber art, of embroidery. And by the way, home embroidery is a great place to look for commercial people. Commercial people are great for home embroiderers to look at for efficiency and techniques and use of materials too. But that's the thing, we go back and forth because home embroidery people will use more materials, more colors. Commercial people will pare it down into its base level so that it's production ready. And we will also have different tools available to us that can show us these options. But sometimes we can mock the tools. Like I said, I do embroidered edges that look like patches. I did Marrow style stitching way before the tools that do it automatically now that now we produce with Merrily over at Brilliance. Before you could do it automatically, I used to do it years and years ago by making my own motifs around borders and making custom borders of, at first, just like satins combined with different stitches on top. Later on, doing custom motifs that I repeated around borders. It was something that you just learned to say, I want this look of this kind of thread. How can I draw that with the tools that I have, and exploring those tools? So let's go ahead and see if I can share. Hopefully I can share the other little part I was going to share earlier. If we can't, we'll just go ahead and call it because we were way into bonus time today. If we end up where sharing this does not work out, we will go ahead and stop. Let's go ahead and pull this back up to the stream. And I have actually the entire browser now. It looks like it worked. First thing, just one more shout out to Jeremy and Joe Kramer, the folks at Amber Creative. That's amb3r.com. If you didn't check that stuff out on Two Other Guys, just go see all this cool stuff that they do in these styles of hand-painted logo work and illustrations and the kind of like awesome applique pieces they do, all the cool stuff that they do. Check that stuff out. Sometimes I just go on a run. I'm like, what's a cool brand that has something interesting? The streetwear company Super Dry does lots of cool embroidery. And if we look at some of this stuff, like check out this cool faded piece. See how they're filling that? That is something that is much more like a satin style fill that's done out of little chunks of satin stitches layered down with the colors in an ombre progression from top to bottom. Not a smooth gradient, but look at how cool it is. They split up those letters and we have that cool kind of fill. Let me go ahead and bring this up a little bigger so you can probably see it better. But yeah, check that out. So that's Super Dry. That's straight out of a brand. I'm not going to belabor it, but sometimes you can just say, I want to look at stuff and go to Google Images. Even if you're not really curating it, just be like, all right, hand embroidery. And we start looking at florals. We look at how people are doing how they do silk shading in a floral piece and say, how can I shade with vertical lines like that? How can I use different chunks of stitching to make up these little florets? And you say, how does that going to play out in your actual custom work? And I'll tell you, one of the ways it played out for me, I had an order where somebody said, all right, I want a classic floral spray coming out of a gun for this logo. And I went back to those original silk shading methods. Now, I don't have a good picture of it here. I've got this horrible fuzzy picture, but this was part of what went on their eventual jacket back. And they wanted these classic florals. So I leaned back on these super old school florals, right? So hand embroidery, stuff like that. Classic bullion blazer badges. Go look at that. Is it embroidery we can do technically with our machines? No, but how much can we learn from the way that they use the reflectivity off of that metal for hand embroidered bullion pieces? I've showed you guys before the vintage Sukajan jackets that we have that are kind of in that same kind of field, the stuff that was coming out of like the post-war world over there. And what a cool set of jackets and inspirational pieces. Go look at the episode where I talk all about them and break down some of the style of the Sukajan jackets, and you'll see this really cool embroidery that doesn't look like the way it looks now because they used different styles of stitches to fill areas. Classic bowling shirts done with chain stitch. Put that into Google Images, start looking at 1950s bowling shirts, something selling on eBay right now, and check out the way they used a single color and how they laid stuff out and how much power they got out of a single color and a single stitch type. It's just cool stuff to look at. Go check out hand-guided chain stitch embroidery from all sorts of different folks. Not only are you going to see people doing hand embroidery with chain stitch, you'll see the classic guided chain stitch stuff done to fill areas, the classic stuff that was done for patches, that was done for the original old school name patches and badges, and the kind of stuff that's commonly done now where we're starting to get back into this world of that. But then we can get things like logo wear done on a chain stitch machine that's super classic. Pardon me, guys. But we can look at some of those images, and depending on what site you're on, you might be able to get some zoom ins and whatever and check that stuff out. Folk embroidery from different areas of the world. We have here some Polish stuff. We have some Eastern European stuff that's in here. And we can see we've got like toll painting. We have all these motifs and colorways that we can use as inspiration. And believe me, I've done bohemian shirts that are very much based in this kind of folk embroidery, and looking at the originals helps you to figure out how to tear it apart. How could I use my tools to make this radial sun stitch? How could I make this feather stitch? What custom motif would I use to create this piece on my machine without putting every stitch exactly where it's supposed to go? Can I use the old school cross stitch generator built into my design system, into my digitizing, to put something like this together and use it for a fill inside of a logo? Let's say for a company that has a tie to a particular nation. Let's say we've got like a Swedish company. We want to use old school Swedish embroidery techniques from a period of time and fill their logo with it, or use it for an all over applique print. These are all things we can do. 1800 samplers, vintage samplers that have all this different kind of needlework. And certainly a lot of it's going to be cross-stitch style samplers. We've got all of these different kind of color schemes, lettering styles and stuff. And you'd say all of this stuff, how are you bringing this all together? How does this kind of play in the world of commercial embroidery? And I'd say, are you going to make that all the time? No. Have I made cross-stitch pieces for commercial embroidery? Absolutely. Many of them. Have I made pieces that referred to vintage embroidery? Yeah. Did a lot of bowling shirts for modern teams and used the inspiration from vintage bowling shirts and the tools of modern embroidery to make something interesting. Have I done military? Yeah, absolutely. I've done stuff for modern military units and for people in the veterans world who were visiting with old school military units. And I researched how the old school patches worked and used stitch types from those, overlapping satin fills, things that looked like the vintage world, with my modern tools to make something more interesting that spoke to them. Have I used inspiration from these different places? Yeah, because even if you're looking at a floral design that has old school satin shading in it, that shading might be the perfect thing to do a little bit of gradient work inside of a letter. It might be the perfect thing to do a little bit of gradient work inside of a logo in an angle that's not the usual flat fills all horizontal. All of these things can play into what we are able to do. And it's about building our toolbox. It's about having that arsenal of different techniques in our head, and seeing that world of inspiration means that when someone comes to us and says, what's possible? What can I do? We have somewhere to go. So like I said, I know it wasn't detailed. We weren't talking about individual techniques, and we can talk about more of those. If you have a specific technique you want to hear more about, by all means, send me an email, drop me a comment. Use the contact us on ericcampbell.com. Comment here on any of the places where you're watching this now and let me know, because we can cover more of it. But in between here and there, what I'd love you to do is think about these things that we can do, right? Alteration. How can we change a piece? What can we change about it? Combination, right? What can we bring together? What different elements, what disparate elements, what style choices can we bring together to make something new that might not have been there before we put those together? Expansion. What can we add? Can we add multimedia? Can we do something different? Can we take something that doesn't seem like it goes together and make it go together? Can we add embroidery to print? Can we add something dimensional to a printed piece? Can we make something 3D on the piece? What can we add? Can we add a piece that's different? Can we change the shape of our patches? Can we add another location? Can we add a simple embroidery to a printed piece and make something new? Can we add rhinestones to our embroidery and add a little shine to the piece that wouldn't have been that way in the first place? Can we print something multimedia and stitch around it? What can we add? And then finally, constrictions. What are the ways that we can narrow it down? How can we control it? What can we take it away? And what can we reduce so that we get to something actionable that speaks to our audience, that means something to them and lets us move forward? because the best thing we can do is start moving forward. You can't steer a parked car. You need to get moving. Certainly you can find out you're moving in the wrong direction, but you'll never know until you hit the gas on it once in a while. All right, folks, with that, I'm going to let you guys go. There's all kinds of cool stuff going on. I mean, look out there in the world. Embroidery expands every day. Decoration expands every day. People are adding multimedia. People are using new tools. There are massive changes as far as what is available, and everyone has more of a chance to try different materials, try different threads, use specialty needles, and to develop techniques. We're all out here making stuff and sharing. Learn from the people who are making cool new techniques. Try some stuff for yourself, but also take in the historical information, take in the stuff that's been around before, and then use that as your springboard to make something new. All right, folks, take some time, make some time to play, try some things out, let yourself fail. Failure is never fatal, but is always educational. And take care of yourselves until next week. I can't wait to do it again.